A very good afternoon to all of you. You still awake? I would like to thank TEXA for the great opportunity. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Anthony, for bringing me over from Latin America, where I live. And I thought that coming here to Melbourne, I would deepen my friendship with Anthony and his colleagues, but I ask you, what kind of a friend is it who puts a highly jet-lagged person like me to speak in the middle of the afternoon? And that reminds me of an incident I had many years ago when I was still teaching in my home country, Morocco, after lunch, and something happened that hopefully never happened to the academics here, is that one of my students fell asleep. And worse than that, he was snoring loudly. So I asked the student next to him, could you please wake him up? The student said, no, professor, you put him to sleep, you wake him up. And so to make sure you don't fall asleep, I'm going to try to involve you into this conversation. Let's start with a quiz. Can anybody recognize this charming lady on the screen? I'll give you a hint. Her name is Erna Solberg. Does it ring a bell? She's the Prime Minister of Norway. Well, let's hope you do better on the next question. What is Norway's main source of wealth? And I'll give you a hint. Oil and gas. They have the richest sovereign fund in the world. And yet, when Mrs. Solberg became the Prime Minister a few years back, in one of her first speeches, she astonished her fellow citizens by telling them, we need to forget about oil. Knowledge is the oil of the future. And increasingly, we see countries putting tertiary education as a source of knowledge at the heart of their development efforts. Not only the Nordic countries, as I mentioned, but closer, Europe, they want to become the most dynamic knowledge economy in the world, and closer to you, the so-called Asian tigers or dragons, whichever animal you prefer. Next question, can you recognize this fisherman's village in 1965? Anyone? Singapore, great. At least one person is still awake. Singapore, 1965, when they become independent. It's an island with no resources. They have to import everything from the food, the water they drink, energy. Per capita GDP, back then, is $500. Australia is 5 times as rich as Singapore back then. Now, if you traveled recently to Singapore, you may have noticed a small difference. The smart city, if you took a taxi from the airport to your hotel, that taxi may have been driverless. Now, which resources do they use to become one of the richest countries on our planet today? $65,000 per capita GDP. Now they are 20% richer than Australia. So what happened? Did they strike gold? Or was it all based on knowledge and talent? Let me give you just one example. A friend of mine was the dean of the Faculty of Engineering at National University of Singapore. And one day he has his eureka moment. He said, okay, we don't have resources, but we do share a resource that most countries on our planet share, the sun. So he asked his professors to tell him who are the leading experts in that field. And they came back the next day telling them in Germany there is this professor, Joachim Luther. So the dean traveled to Germany to meet with Professor Luther to explain about the beauty and exciting world of Singapore. The professor was very dismissive and, looking at his watch, I'm very busy. Thank you for telling me about Singapore, I'm not interested, go away. But the dean, who is a bit stubborn, took out of his pocket 2 business class tickets and said, "This is for you and your wife. Why don't you come and visit Singapore just to see by yourself?" Now I'm going to show you a picture of the inauguration of the new Solar Energy Research Institute at NUS a few years back. On the left, you have the president of Singapore, former president of the Academy of Science, and on the right, the first director of the institute. Can anyone guess the name of that first director? Right. And when he came not only with his knowledge, but with hundreds of thousands of dollars of research contracts. And as a result, as one example of the contribution of NUS to the country's development, they became a source of talent and research, and a powerful Norwegian firm came and set up a big solar panel plant, which is so successful that it was now bought up by the Chinese. So the question I would ask is, what's happening in Australia? Are the universities contributing, and to the other tertiary education institutions contributing in the same way to the development of Australia? And to answer this question, I've divided my presentation into 3 parts. I want to give you an outsider's view of Australia's performance, because I heard over the past 2 days many complaints about all the things that are not going well, but I would like to put that in perspective. And then remind ourselves that we are living in a highly changing and rapidly and challenging world. And finally, talk about the sad erosion of trust that I see in the world of higher education and elsewhere. So to talk about performance, I'm going to refer to something that happened in 2003 at Shanghai Jiaotong University, where these 3 innocent-looking gentlemen published the first academic ranking of world universities, commonly known as the Shanghai ranking. Now, little did they realize back then how many nightmares they would create among vice chancellors all over the world, didn't they? So I have developed what I call the World Class University Index. What I do is looking at the number of universities each country has in the top 100, and I divided that by the log of the population. And here are the results. Back in 2004, first USA, that's to be expected, then UK. So we have big countries, UK, Germany, Japan, France, and then in 10th position, Australia. It's okay, but not so great. But if we move forward, the latest ranking, 2019, and you may have noticed that I also included California and Massachusetts, because if they were separate countries, they would also be very high in the ranking. And now we have first USA, UK, no change there. And who is number 3rd? Australia. Isn't that impressive? So when we compare both 2004 and 2019, what has changed? We had 17 countries back then, 18 now. 2 countries are out, Austria and Italy. 3 new countries in, Belgium, China, and Singapore. And who is rising in these rankings? Australia and China are the 2 countries which are doing best. And you are the leader. And I think that should be celebrated. Now, and it's not only about, we're looking here about the research universities, but economic development, especially at the regional level, is fueled by all the graduates of the non-universities, or all the institutions, the TVET, technical, etc., that are represented in this room, that contribute the highly qualified employees contributing to the local development. That should also be celebrated. And then, very often we see that excellence happens at the expense of equity. And here again, I want to share some good news with you. 2 days ago, the world celebrated the World Access to Higher Education Day. Some of your university may have been involved. And when it was first celebrated a year ago, I was invited by the Lumina Foundation to do a study, a survey of how national policies on equity are developed. So I surveyed 71 countries, and as part of the work, I did benchmarking the leaders, advanced countries, then established, developing, and emerging. And who are the leaders among the 6 most advanced countries in terms of having a comprehensive equity policy aligned with measures and funding and leadership? I find Australia, Cuba, England, Ireland, New Zealand, and Scotland. And this year, the Lumina Foundation asked me to do a follow-up paper with 5 country studies: Vietnam, Colombia, South Africa, Austria, and Australia. And here are some of the findings of some of the great things you are doing in this domain. Starting with information, you would be surprised how few countries have detailed information as you have. Plus, you have an equity research center at Curtin University funded by government. But you don't have only one. You have another one at Newcastle University and one at La Trobe University. So many countries do not even study equity in higher education, let alone do something about it. You have, somebody complained about the student debt yesterday, didn't you? But still, in my book, you have one of the best funding system with the income contingent loan system, which is both fair and efficient. Very few countries have that. You have HEP that has really be a catalyst with universities to focus on equity. And again, you are one of the few countries in the world where the QA system takes equity as one of its criteria. However, not everything is rosy, and here this is my interpretation of what I understand of your system, and maybe I got it all wrong, but it seems that in recent years public funding has not been as forthcoming as it used to be. You yourself during these 2 days have raised the question, are you relying too much on international students? If you look at attainment, education attainment across the 6 states, there are quite significant differences. So some regions are doing better than others. Lack of program differentiation and mission differentiation across the university sector. Insufficient connection between the universities and all the other tertiary education providers. And I have heard, sorry Anthony, some complaints about over-accountability. Now, if you think that these are bad news, I have more news for you. Because if we look at our world, I don't think that it looks like that. It's not smooth sailing for the world of higher education. It's more like this. President Hennessy of Stanford University talked about the tsunami caused by the digital era in which we have entered. Education 4.0, Industrial Revolution 4.0. A few features of changes that have an impact on quality assurance. First of all, the world of work is changing. And I was able to take a picture of the main culprit. The world of work is changing rapidly. 700 professions have disappeared in recent years, according to an analysis done by 2 economists at Oxford University. And then we have all these new jobs. Here is a list of jobs that are very common today that did not exist 10 years ago. App developer, digital risk manager, driverless car engineer, big data analyst, drone operator. We're not talking about a weekend occupation with your children. Drones for in the health sector, in the army, for commerce, etc. Now, how many of your institutions train people in these disciplines, in these programs? And then also accepting that existing jobs, even if they don't disappear, will change radically. How do you design your programs for jobs we have no clues about? The World Economic Forum gives us this picture of 21st century skills. On the left is what basic and secondary education provide, the foundational skills. But then the middle and the right, this is what is your responsibility. First of all, competencies to work and live in a complex society. Critical thinking, creativity, communication, collaboration. As I travel around the world, I like not only to visit university, but also to talk to employers. And believe me, wherever I go, I hear the same answer. Yeah, this university, local university, they're training great professionals. But these people, they don't know how to work. And then we have the so-called character qualities, the socio-emotional skills that allow us to be successful in our profession and as citizens. Curiosity, initiative, persistence, learning from our failures and errors, adaptability in this changing world, leadership, and last but not least, social and cultural awareness and all the ethical skill, ability that we need. Another big change, the profile of our learners. This is my first grandchild, Emilio. At age 1.5, he started to use my iPad. And today, he can do things I have no clue I didn't have any clue that we could do that on an iPad. Now, I tell you, the students who come into our universities here, it's a different species from what we were. The French writer Paul Valéry used to say, you know what's the trouble about the future is that it's not what it used to be. And I think we have the same trouble with our students today. The E generation, they operate in a different mode, and we cannot offer them something that was perhaps right for us. Today, learning cannot be a spectator sport. And I take the title of a very nice book on education innovation to remind us about the importance of being student-centered, sparking curiosity, igniting passion, unleashing genius, which means that we need to introduce some of the education innovation that you are already at the forefront of. Transforming your curriculum, we had some presentations, active and interactive pedagogy, appropriate use of new technologies, and I want to insist on the point that I think is often missed, the importance of also innovating in assessment. And I talk about the golden triangle, which brings together curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. Too often I visit a university, they're doing great things to transform the curriculum, to make it experiential, to have student-centered pedagogy. And then when it comes to exams day, it's more of the same. Just a few pictures to illustrate some of these changes. This is a German university where the TA, the teaching assistants, is an AI-driven robot here on the picture. Or this professor appearing in the form of a hologram at the Tech of Monterrey in Mexico, enabling him to interact with the students on several campuses live at the same time. Victoria University in New Zealand, they've redesigned their curriculum to be all for using VR as a way of having a field visit every day. And they do that in most of their programs. Another important change, if we think about use the demographic lens that Mr. Megalogenis used yesterday, I guess I'm not making a big mistake if I would say that this is the shape of your universities or tertiary education institutions today. Now, my prediction is that in the future, you should be more star-shaped, where the young people coming out of high school will be only a minority of your students, and you'll have to worry more about continuing professional education and career change studies and mixing presential and online learning. And some of your students will have a different profile. Do we have anybody here from Southern Cross University? Well, this is one of your young graduates, 93 young graduates, recently getting his PhD. And I don't want to be accused of gender bias. So lifelong learning education, we talk a lot about it, but how much of what you do as a tertiary education institution is focusing on lifelong learning? The shape of degrees is changing. Forget about the traditional degrees. Now we have joint degrees with courses taken at several institutions in one country and maybe in several countries at the same time. Micro-credentials, nano courses, mini masters, and increasingly we see a separation between degrees, learning, and credentials. Now, some of you may want to stop me and say, enough of these changes, right? Wouldn't we love to be able to say, okay, we got it, we've made all these changes for the next 3 years, it's going to be no more disruption. Well, I've got news for you. We live now in what I call the beta mode, where change is constant, whether we like it or not. And we need to adapt as it comes, which means that we need an open mind to accept innovation and humility, accept that we are all learning as we go. And as if the world I'm describing were not complicated enough, to make matters worse, I see an erosion of trust. I mean, we already had some very striking examples in the discussion of contract cheating. But it goes beyond that, and I see two major challenges. First, we live in a world increasingly fraught with fraud, and we now live in this world strangely called a post-truth world. So a few pictures to illustrate this issue of fraud. So if you walk in the streets of Lima, Peru, you might come across this beautiful new university with a very nice building ahead of you. But if you were to sneak behind the building, this is what you would see. I guess this is the proper use of the word facade. Now, those of you who are familiar with what's going on with India, this issue of cheating is very prevalent. In fact, one of the student union last year was making the request that we should accept cheating as a way of life. Stop bothering us. Now, not everybody agrees with that. So last month in the Indian state of Karnataka, we had this incident where the students at the time of exam were provided with a cardboard with 2 holes for their eyes to make sure that they could not see anything right or left and could not cheat. Sadly, fraud, corruption, and lack of integrity takes many forms. You heard about the latest admission scandal in the US, plagiarism, fraud at exams, contract cheating, sexual harassment, degree meals, accreditation meals, fake academic journals, and conferences. And it's hard. We have some countermeasures, but it's always as if we are one step behind, except in Ireland, of course. So sometimes we try to resort to shame, which in East Asia, for example, works very well. So newspapers publishing the list of members of parliament whose degree has been found out to be fraudulent. In Romania, there was a very interesting experiment, the so-called Coalition for Clean Universities. Student unions and teacher unions getting together to do an integrity ranking of public universities. South Africa just decided that if you are caught with a fake degree, you go straight to jail, no discussion. Sometimes technology may be helpful. Yesterday we had our speaker, former vice chancellor for Deakin University, told us about blockchain and how she believes in that. And This is the first blockchain degree at the Tech of Monterey. So it is happening and it can help. And also we may be able to have to separate the sanction of the degree or the exam by university and outside independent verification. In India, because of the loss of trust in what the universities produce, we see this company, Aspiring Minds, that has been very successful. They have their own tests, and many companies resort to them because they don't believe the results of universities. So Aspiring Minds has reached now 1,100 universities. Last year, they tested 5 million people, and they are going beyond India to other parts of the world. Now, the other part is this post-truth world. And it all started on the 23rd of June 2016 with the Brexit vote. And at the end of that year, Oxford Dictionary came out with this new word, post-truth. Circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. So we have the world before 2016. It's been only 3 years, and yet think about all the changes. It's not only one Brexit, but several Brexits. And in a way, we see the end of rationality. So you can assert that leaving the EU will save millions of pounds to the UK. Now we know this is wrong, this is not true, and yet you might get to become prime minister when you have made these kind of assertions. In the UK, as was mentioned yesterday, we are fed up with listening to the experts, and many of the experts are in the universities. But it's not that new. President Bush Jr., before the invasion of Iraq, has said, I don't care what the facts say. And sure, Mr. Spicer's, sadly known as with his association with the Trump administration, we're going to present alternative facts. Think about it. And sometimes it's fine to disagree with the facts. And so we live in this world of fake news, post-truth, untruth. And the sad consequence for universities is that we don't believe in scientific evidence anymore. So the theory of evolution has to be taught in parallel with creativity in many universities now. India nominated a higher education minister recently who doesn't believe in evolution. I'm told that there are some countries where the head of state or the prime minister doesn't believe in climate change. Sadly, in Pakistan, people go around and shoot the nurses who give vaccines to young children to save their lives. Recently in Tunisia, a PhD student was about to defend a dissertation in physics to demonstrate that the world is flat. And 2 weeks ago in Dallas, Texas, we had a Flat Earth International Conference. And many countries go around changing the history books, rewriting. And if you think about the GPRE resolution in Europe, that has now the consequence that any individual can force Google to erase any trace of their past. So tomorrow, the children of, or grandchildren or great-grandchildren of Hitler, using this regulation, might be able to erase any trace of what happened during Nazi Germany. Think about the consequences. And sadly, in many corners, academia has lost credibility, convincing power, and respect. So I think we all have a very important responsibility as QA agency and as higher education providers to work on behalf of restoring critical thinking and respect for scientific evidence. Together working to distinguish between real evidence and fabricated information. So giving our students truth-seeking skills. Reinstate the tradition of fair and free academic debates that have been undermined by relativism and political correctness in many countries. Rebuild trust in academics and in science, and improve the channels of communication between your institutions and society at large, being proud of relying on evidence. And a good example for me in the pursuit of truth is not what the French are trying to do. 2 weeks ago, the French Parliament passed a law that would obligate universities to teach about climate change. Immediately, many university presidents said, wait a minute. This is a big infringement on our academic freedom. It should not be by decree or by law, but because we are convinced that this is the right thing to do if you are teaching science. So to regain trust of the public, for me, a good example is what McGill University in Montreal is doing. Every year, they have a week they call the Lone Trotter Public Science Symposium Series. It's really to educate the press and the public at large about scientific developments that impact our daily life or our future. So in conclusion, to paraphrase Shakespeare, to trust or not to trust. So to come here to Melbourne, thank you, Texa, took me 2 days and 4 flights. So one of the activities during these flights was to read this very interesting book called The Vanishing Velasquez. It's non-fiction, but it reads like a novel. It's the true story of this gentleman, obscure bookseller in Reading, England, who by chance came upon a painting that he identified as a lost Velasquez. But how do you prove that at a time where you don't have photography, so you cannot compare or have disseminate this picture across the world? You cannot do X-ray analysis or chemical analysis. Mr. Velasquez didn't use to sign his paintings. So, I mean, it's a fascinating, sad story because it became his life pursuit and also it's messed up his life. There were trials and everything, but what I find very interesting, at that time, to reach a conclusion, it was all based on trust. So it was really a lot of trust. Now I want to move to another example, very close to us, which may show a case of perhaps too much trust. 29 October 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 takes off from Jakarta, and within 17 minutes, it becomes a disaster, plunging into the sea. 189 people died. 5 months later, Ethiopian Air 302 on March 10, 2019, takes off from Addis Ababa, and within a few minutes, same tragedy. 157 people died, including 2 of my former colleagues from the World Bank. Now, as the inquiry unfolds, we see that over the years, the Federal Aviation Authority of the US had delegated key security decisions to Boeing, the provider. And we see now that there was an internal culture of hastiness, cutting corners because of profits, and you're competing with Airbus, so you cannot be behind. And disregarding safety advice from key internal stakeholders. And while a university that fails doesn't kill its students with it, still your responsibility is to shape the future of your students. And so we have to think about finding the right balance between trust and regulations, or between trust and evidence to justify distrust. And I think that's one of the major challenges for institution agencies like TEXA. But in a way, within each university or each tertiary education institution, you face the same challenge. Two professors from the University of Oslo, Stenserker and Maassen, have come up with this matrix of measures along two dimensions, what they call rational instrumental and normative cognitive, and what they call the hard evidence and soft evidence. Moving from legal, financial regulations, accreditation, to the softest part, which has to do with use of reliance on strategic advisory boards and partnerships, which is what we've been discussing here over the past two days. And so, if I may leave you with a few elements of advice, I think one of the challenges is how do you enforce standards at the same time, standards that are linked to the past, at the same time recognize innovative features with innovation in curriculum, pedagogy, assessment, degree configuration, etc. And perhaps by focusing less on inputs and process and more on outcomes and added value, learning achievement, competencies acquired, and not forgetting the important equity filter, reminding us that we need not only focus on access, but really on success. And many of the parallel sessions dealt with some of these dimensions. Integrate valid elements of new accountability instruments. The voice of the students through the student engagement service. The voice of society through labor market results, the opinion of employers. Accepting to recognize new credentials. And here again, technology can help with the use of predictive analytics and big data. How do we thrive under disruption? It's hard to measure results when the environment is changing completely. We are on shifting grounds. So try to rely on a multiplicity of measures rather than just one metric. Build accountability as a partnership rather than strictly regulations. And partnerships not being fueled by contracts, but based on trust. And cultivate, strengthen what makes QA unique. Intellectual and institutional independence, flexibility, collaboration. Remember, QA is by and for the members, and I think this conference illustrates that very well, in partnership with all the stakeholders and the partners. And finishing maybe with some definitions or some features of trust. Trust can be powerful when it is earned by actions, not just by words. But trust is also fragile. Often say that it takes years to build, seconds to break, forever to repair. And trust is about truth. It starts with truth, it ends with truth. And I want to add a last point. Trust has to be based on respect. And no matter how critical you are about your own society, we heard the students warning that they didn't want to be seen as customers, but as real partners. We heard some complaints about over-accountability, etc. But one thing I must say, and I'm not trying to be polite because I'm your host, but I've had the privilege of working in about 100 countries on this planet. And I can tell you one of the features I really see in your country is how genuinely conducting stakeholder consultations has become part of your modus operandi. Recently, one of my colleagues, you may know the name Alex Usher from Canada, was observing, comparing the process to redefine academic freedom in these difficult days of post-truth, and how the difference, the contrast between Canada and Australia. Where in Canada there was an edict from the minister, whereas in Australia, I'm told that your new code of academic freedom has been well received because it has really been designed as a result of very wide stakeholder consultation. So I think you should celebrate this element and continue to work and build trust based on respect. Yesterday, Mr. Megalogenis told us, if I understood properly, that a new trend in Australia is to have this polarized population that you didn't have before. And so let's hope that this will not translate also into the tertiary education sector, and that you will keep on respecting each other, working together towards what this picture best illustrates. You won't let me down, will you?